Good evening. You are listening to another slow step backward into the dusted folds of forgotten human history. Nothing here will hurry, nothing here will shout. This is the story of things people would rather not remember, but that someone always had to do. Tonight, we begin with the waste of others, the filth, the excrement, and the people who spent their lives knee-deep in it. This is the quiet, revolting world of the gong farmers. In the heavy darkness of a medieval night, when all lamps had long burned down to wax puddles and the taverns stank of sour ale and spit, a man with a leather bucket might descend beneath your very feet. There, in the sunless vaults beneath privies and tenement walls, he would stand ankle-deep in waste, scraping hardened layers of human filth from stone and timber. These men were called gong farmers. The word gong came from the Old English gan or gang, meaning to go, to walk, or to void oneself. A gong farmer, then, was not so much a name as an eternal joke, a farmer of going, a reaper of the going gong. They worked by law after twilight. They were not permitted to ply their trade during daylight because the stench, it was said, might offend God and man alike. So they waited for dark. When the town slept, they went underground. The tools were primitive, but enduring. A bucket made of hide and rope, a shovel scraped to bone, a lantern wrapped in cloth so as not to blind the rats. Sometimes the pits were shallow and could be emptied in a night. Other times they had been forgotten for years, and the gong farmer would find himself shoulder deep in solidified decay, slicing through strata of human history formed entirely from bowels and time. They were not slaves, though many lived like they were. In fact, the pay could be surprisingly generous. In 16th century London, a skilled gong farmer might earn 6 pence a day, far more than a farmhand or apprentice. Some grew wealthy. Some even formed guilds and negotiated contracts with the city, especially when plague loomed and sanitation grew urgent. But wealth did not buy respect. Gong farmers were required to live apart from others. They often resided near the outskirts of cities, close to fields and cesspits, where the waste could be carted and dumped, or dried into set, what was cheerfully known as night soil. That was the end goal, not just to remove the filth, but to turn it into something reusable. Night soil was a fertilizer. It fed crops. It returned to mouths. The cycle of waste was complete. But the job took its toll. The ammonia burned the skin. The fumes damaged the lungs. In poorly ventilated pits, a gong farmer might collapse from the buildup of noxious gases, most often hydrogen sulfide, a gas that smelled of rotten eggs and death. The records tell of men who fell into the muck and never climbed out. Others were overcome by the heat and weight and slowly suffocated, their cries unheard beneath floorboards and stone. Some said it was a death fit for the unloved. Others said it was no death at all, just a return to the same soil they had served their whole lives. Children sometimes assisted, so did wives. In the poorest corners of medieval towns, entire families shared the trade. A boy might learn how to lift the bucket without spilling it, how to light the lantern low, how to move silently among the chambers of human waste. It was not a romantic apprenticeship, but it was a skill. And in the rare moments when no one else would do it, the gong farmer held all the power. No feast, no castle, no council could long survive with privies overflowing. And so they called for him, and then they turned their faces when he came. There was a rhythm to the work. Lift, scrape, pour. The contents were carried in covered carts at night, wheeled down alleys where no one looked. Sometimes they were dumped into the Thames. Sometimes they were buried in pits on the edge of town. Sometimes they were sold to farmers who sifted it with straw and ash. In Japan, night soil was a valuable commodity, collected with care and bought by the bucket. In Europe, it was more shameful, but still necessary. No one wanted to admit it. Everyone needed it. The social cost was immense. Gong farmers were considered unclean, not just physically, but morally. They were assumed to be rough, crude, base. Their touch was feared, their breath avoided. In some places, they had to announce themselves in public spaces, lest their presence contaminate those of higher status. And yet there are no records of them revolting, no great uprising of the dung diggers. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was something else, a strange, bitter pride in being the ones who kept the filth from reaching the doorstep, the ones who kept disease a little farther away, the ones who bore the shame so others would not have to. They show up occasionally in parish records and court rolls. Fines for dumping waste too close to wells, disputes with neighbors over cesspit boundaries, hired for a few pence and forgotten the next week. But their traces remain, quite literally, in the archaeological record. In the dark, sticky soil of medieval cities, archaeologists have found layers upon layers of human waste, thick with straw, seeds, and parasites. These layers tell stories, what people ate, what they feared, what they buried, and beneath it all is the quiet labor of the ones who took it away. There are even fragments of poetry, strange and rude, scrawled in the margins of manuscripts or whispered in alehouses, that mention the gong farmer with a mix of laughter and dread. One such rhyme from the late 15th century reads in rough English: "He comes by night with shovel wide and takes the devil's gifts inside. He leaves no trace by morning bell, but carries with him half of hell." No one sang these songs in churches. No one carved statues to honor the gong farmer. But he was as necessary as the priest, perhaps more so. For what use is a sermon when your cellar floods with excrement? What use is a king if the palace stinks? In time, the profession changed. Cesspits gave way to sewers. Urban planning began to imagine waste not just as an afterthought, but as something to be managed. In the 19th century, with the advent of public health movements and modern sanitation, the old ways slowly disappeared. But even then, someone had to clean the pipes. Someone had to enter the tunnel. In Victorian London, workers known as flushers or navvies walked the underbelly of the city, shoveling and scraping. Just as the gong farmers had centuries before, the names changed, the stench remained. Today we call them sanitation workers, sewer technicians, waste management professionals. The tools are cleaner, the clothing is modern, the shame is more subtle, but the truth lingers. Civilization has always rested on the backs of those willing to carry what others would rather forget. And so the gong farmer, though vanished in name, remains with us in spirit. In every clean street, in every flushed toilet, in every field fertilized with something more than sunshine. And as you drift now into the dim corners of memory and sleep, remember that even the foulest labor held a strange kind of dignity, that someone had to go into the dark so others could sleep in peace, that even filth, when touched by human hands, becomes a story. There was a time when the streets emptied, not because people fled, but because the bodies had stopped moving and the bells had stopped tolling. A time when the air hung with the scent of death, sweetened by rotting fruit and distant incense, and no one dared look too long at their neighbor's door. In the cities and the villages, under the long, patient eye of the medieval moon, there were figures who moved when no one else would, their silhouettes long and still at the threshold, their feet black with soot or caked mud, their breathing slow under thick layers of dark cloth, and over their faces a beak, that strange and spectral visage which has come to symbolize the plague doctor, but which in truth shielded very little. It was a mask that promised protection, but gave mostly discomfort and anonymity, stuffed with lavender and wormwood, and sometimes camphor or a vinegar sponge, in the belief that foul smells could be warded off by fragrant ones. That disease was an odor you could dodge if only you masked your nose properly. In those long years when the Black Death visited and revisited, the people who wore the beaked masks were not healers in the sense we imagine. They were often not trained physicians at all, but men hired by the city to catalog the dead, to tend to the sick when no one else dared, to witness and record and survive if possible. Most did not. The masks did little. The gloves and waxed robes were thin barriers against fleas and air heavy with infection. And though the wide-brimmed hats and staves gave them a theatrical appearance, the performance was a hollow one. The plague doctor was not a savior, but a silent observer, a paper barrier between chaos and documentation. It was said in some towns that when you heard the slow tapping of the plague doctor's cane on the cobblestone, you had 2 days left. Some people swore the doctor brought the plague, not simply came in its wake. Parents warned their children that the bird-masked man would come in the night if they misbehaved, but when he did come, there was no punishment, only silence. A scribble on a ledger, and a house marked with a cross. Plague doctors sometimes carried posies to their patients, not as gifts, but to cover the smell, which no cloth or herb could really hide. Their robes were usually boiled after use, if they were boiled at all. And sometimes they slept in sheds outside the cities or in abandoned houses that already smelled of mildew and damp paper and the faint traces of other people's dreams. There were others who walked the same streets but had no masks and no records to keep, the corpse collectors. Sometimes they were hired by the city, given a few coins or a loaf of bread to go from house to house with carts or stretchers and pull the bodies from wherever they fell, slumped over a kitchen bench, curled at the foot of a bed, collapsed mid-prayer beside a candle still flickering. They worked through the night in some places, silent as shadows and just as unwelcome. These were not men with clean boots or quiet confidence. These were often beggars, prisoners, men promised forgiveness if they agreed to carry death on their shoulders for a day or two. In later years, women joined the effort. Old widows, midwives with no work, young girls who were told they'd earn their bread this way or not at all. And so they came in rags and carried the weight of the unclaimed bodies, bloated, twisted, cold, children wrapped in shawls, infants with blood dried around their noses, entire households stiff on straw mats. The collectors did not ask names. They dragged, they bundled, they grunted as they lifted, and they pulled carts behind them that groaned like injured animals. There are records of carts filled with 20 or 30 corpses at a time, dumped into massed graves at the edge of the city. Sometimes the pits were lime-lined, sometimes not. Sometimes there was a priest nearby muttering Latin under his breath. Sometimes only crows watched. Bells were supposed to ring for each death, but when the death toll surpassed the bell-ringer's stamina, silence returned. And in that silence, the collectors kept working. There were nights when the grave was not dug fast enough, and the carts were simply left nearby until morning. There were stories of wolves wandering into the city to feed, of dogs growing fat on what they scavenged, of cats disappearing entirely. And so in this strange choreography of survival, the plague doctor moved through his duties with his ledger and his long cane, and the corpse collector followed with his rope and his cart. Sometimes they crossed paths and did not speak. There was little to say. One marked the body as a statistic, the other removed it. Together they turned cities into ledgers and graveyards into proofs of labor. And still the disease came in waves and whispers, in coughs that turned into seizures, in black sores and sudden fevers, and people found cold in their chairs, with soup still warm beside them. In Italy, in 1630, a doctor named Alessandro Tassi described seeing 30 patients in one day, all with the same purple swellings, all gasping, all dead by nightfall. In France, some plague doctors were accused of fleeing their posts. Others died within days of taking the job. In England, the term searcher was sometimes used, a woman, usually, who would inspect the dead to determine whether plague was the cause. She had no mask, only cloth tied around her mouth, and fingers stained with ashes from disinfecting fires. In Istanbul, during the 16th century, corpse carriers wore white shrouds and moved in teams. In Cairo, the dead were often washed and wrapped quickly by family members, who then fell ill themselves. The disease did not care for ritual. It did not wait for the sacred. It moved quickly and sometimes mercifully. And all this while, the living watched from windows. They closed shutters. They avoided the streets. But always there were those who had to go out, to gather, to bury, to record. In London, during the Great Plague of 1665, it was recorded that more than 1,000 bodies were removed in a single week from the poorer parishes. In Venice, entire neighborhoods were sealed and left to rot. In Prague, in Paris, in village after village, across the Alps, and the Low Countries, and the reaches of Bavaria and the western Slavic forests. The black carts rolled, and the masked men tapped their canes, and the dead gave up their names to lists that were burned later anyway. No one wanted to remember, yet we do remember. We remember the mask, though it was only worn in the late period and in specific regions. We remember the carts, though many were simple sleds or sheets dragged over cobbles. We remember the idea of the doctor, though he was often little more than a clerk. We forget the collectors more easily. Their names were not recorded. Their faces are not preserved in illustration, but they were there, night after night, carrying the cost of human frailty down streets too narrow to breathe. The medieval imagination was filled with death, not as something abstract, but as a neighbor, a lover, a constant guest. In art, the Danse Macabre showed skeletons leading kings and popes to the grave in a solemn parade. In sermons, priests reminded their flocks that life was a temporary agony to be endured. But for the corpse collectors and the plague doctors, death was not metaphor. It was weight. It had to be dragged, named, buried. It stained the boots. It soured the breath. Even so, the work was done, not for honor or gratitude, but because someone had to do it. Because the city would collapse under its own rot if no one moved the bodies. Because the living needed a way to pretend life would go on, and so it did. Markets reopened, children were born, bells rang again, but the mask remained in memory, the tapping cane, the rope-burned hands of the collector. The sound of a cart rolling past as the candles flickered low and the door stayed shut. And in that half-silence, in that space between forgetting and remembering, the history lingers. A slow march of figures in the dark, not heroes, not villains, just the people who moved while others stopped, who looked at death and did not flinch, or if they did, they kept moving anyway. They were the men who walked just outside the village, who drank alone at dusk and slept on the edge of the parish ledger. If you saw them, you looked away. If they spoke, you answered briefly. If they touched your sleeve, you burned it, or prayed over it, or tossed it into the river. The executioner had no friends, only neighbors who wished he would vanish. And yet without him, there would be no order, no repentance, no final screams to echo off the church walls. His presence was a necessary disease, a sanctioned cruelty. In medieval and early modern Europe, the man with the axe was not feared for what he might do, but revered and reviled for what he must do. He was a function, not a person, a dark office with a human face. He often inherited the job, not from bloodline, but by accident of circumstance. A man convicted of murder might be offered life instead of the rope-if. He would agree to hang the next man. There were no executioners who returned to farming. Once you accepted the axe, you accepted exile. Cities paid their torturers in coin and in meat. Their children were forbidden to marry, except among their own caste. They were feared and yet needed like the night soil men or the plague doctors. The world had to be kept clean by dirty hands. There were rules, of course, written in city ledgers and royal decrees about how many lashes a back could take before a man was allowed to faint, about how many strokes of the sword it should take to behead a nobleman cleanly. The executioner had to be skilled, for if the crowd saw a botched death, they turned quickly on the blade wielder. A good executioner practiced on pigs or straw dummies. Some families passed down techniques: how to calculate the arc of the axe by eye, how to shift the neck subtly to avoid the spine. And there were performances. The condemned might be walked through the town in fetters, with bells ringing. There were prayers said, confessions mumbled, blindfolds offered and refused. The executioner would often wear gloves, not to keep blood off, but because to touch a criminal with bare skin was thought to transfer sin. Even his hands were not his own. Vendors sold sweets and cider. Men jeered or wept, or both. Women fainted when the blood arced out onto the platform. The condemned often gave speeches. A repentant soul was a comfort to the gathered townsfolk who hoped for their own clean end someday. He offered last words. He sometimes held up the severed head to the crowd like a grim bouquet. This was justice, raw and red and alive in the square. But it was not only beheadings. There was burning for heretics and witches. There was breaking on the wheel for thieves and rebels. There were floggings, whippings, the stocks and pillories, the tongue screw and branding iron. The torturer might be the same man or a colleague. They knew each other by the tilt of a hat, the way they walked with one shoulder lower from years of hauling bodies. The torturer knew anatomy well enough to keep a man conscious but screaming, and he knew to do it where the public could see. For pain was not just punishment, tit was instruction. The lesson was, stay in line or you will bleed like this too. Yet the work carried a cost. Many executioners drank, many never married. Some claimed to be cursed. Their children were born malformed or never lived past infancy. They were often buried in unmarked graves, or, if granted stone, it bore no name. In some regions, executioners were denied communion. In others, they were invited into the sacristy to confess in secret, their hands still smelling of soot and rusted chain. The church debated whether these men could be forgiven. After all, they did not kill in anger, but on behalf of God and King. Still, the weight of many deaths is not easily set down, even when they are lawful. Some executioners wore charms or carried holy relics in their pockets. They prayed before each death knot for the condemned, but for their own soul. The tools of the trade were kept clean but not polished. The axe was not meant to gleam. It was heavy and often nicked. Some cities had official executioner swords, long and flat, with no point, designed only to remove heads. These were stored in special cabinets or hung in chapels as a reminder. The hooded executioner is more myth than fact, yet, in some cases, anonymity was mercy. To kill your neighbor in the morning and pass him in the tavern at night required a kind of forgetting that few could manage. In smaller towns, everyone knew who swung the blade, and they made room when he entered the room. Even if he'd saved their city from riot or rebellion, even if he had prayed harder than the priest, he was not quite human anymore. He had stepped too close to the line between death and justice. Sometimes the line blurred. Executioners became enforcers of unpopular laws. They whipped those who spoke too loudly against the crown. They burned women whose only crime was healing. They stretched the limbs of men whose only sin was asking questions. And sometimes they refused. In 18th century France, a group of executioners resigned en masse rather than torture a nobleman's son who had fallen afoul of the court. Their refusal was punished, of course, but history remembered it. There were limits, even among those whose job it was to end lives. But such rebellions were rare. Most did their work with quiet dread, knowing that if they faltered, someone else would take up the axe and perhaps wield it less kindly. There were rituals. Some executioners washed after each death in sacred water or bathed in vinegar. Some kept ledgers of every man or woman they had dispatched, noting the date, the crime, the final words. One German executioner in the 16th century kept such meticulous records that historians now use them to understand legal trends of the period. He wrote with neat script in a small hand, as though shrinking the words might shrink the weight of them. In Japan, the samurai executioners sometimes wrote poetry before a beheading. In Britain, the gallows came with its own prayer. Each culture found its way to make the horror endurable. It is easier to kill when you believe it matters. Sometimes the executioner was given a name by the people, a nickname, a whisper, the red hand, the man in black, the bone picker, and when they died, their tools were often destroyed or passed on in silence. The office lived on. In some cases, towns begged the king for reprieve, saying they could not find a man to do the killing. In others, men volunteered for the job out of desperation, out of debt, out of vengeance. But none lasted long without changing. To take a life, even for the state, even with permission, twists something inside the ribs. The heart beats slower. The dreams become louder. In some strange cases, the executioner became a kind of folk hero. In 17th century Poland, an executioner once spared a child by refusing to follow an unjust order. The child grew to be a judge and pardoned the executioner's grandson years later. Nothing is clean. The man who beheads may save another. The torturer may offer water to the tortured, and they bore the weight of justice, not just on their shoulders, but on their souls. The morning fog rose over the boglands with a kind of slow indifference, as though it had forgotten how to lift itself from the thick earth below. In the shallows of a marshy pond, a man stood motionless, trousers rolled to his knees, legs submerged in black water that writhed in small, invisible currents. He did not move because movement stirred attention, and attention meant more of them. More of the gliding mouths, the cold suckers, the spiral-jawed creatures that clung to the warmth of human blood. He was a leech collector, a profession not quite admired, and certainly never envied, yet utterly essential to the workings of medicine in the age. Before antiseptic, before germ theory, before anyone thought to doubt the harmony of the four humors, the work demanded skin, patience, and quiet. For the most effective method of collecting leeches was to offer them yourself, your body, as bait, your blood as currency. Women did this work too, and often it was the old, the widowed, the unmarried, those whose labor cost society little, but whose service was still quietly demanded. Leeches were not just needed, they were prized. The bloodletting craze that gripped the medieval and early modern imagination with such firm conviction depended entirely on the humble and horrifying work of the swamp walker. In France, the government once imported millions of leeches per year. In Britain, entire families set out into the wetlands at dawn, children included, standing like statues until their legs went numb from cold or from blood loss. There were tricks, of course. Some wore animals' bladders over their calves, letting the creatures latch on and swell themselves fat on blood not their own. Others coated their limbs in milk to attract them faster. But no method was elegant, and no collector returned home without the telltale ringlets of blood down the shin, or worse, the signs of infection beneath the skin. Leeches were not gathered randomly. The best were chosen carefully, large but not sluggish, dark but not too pale, mouths that worked but did not linger too long. The collectors became connoisseurs, in a sense, of parasitic life. The ponds they visited were known intimately, not by name, but by temperature, by the quality of the mud, by how the reeds bent in the wind. Each swamp was a map of pain and potential. In some parts of England, collectors were accused of over-harvesting, draining the bogs of their living currency. A profession built on the balance of blood required a kind of ecological attention. Too many mouths, and you were feasted upon to the point of faintness. Too few, and the physician's jar would go empty. At the surgery, a patient might have their leeches applied directly to the temple, to the arms, to the groin, places where the blood was thought to congregate, or where the bad humors settled like storm water. Leeches were believed to draw out imbalance, to restore the soul to symmetry. Headaches, melancholy, gout, epilepsy, all might be improved by letting a leech feed. This practice was not fringe, but rather mainstream. Learned doctors praised it in manuscripts bound with leather. Clergy did not forbid it. The church bled patients too. Bleeding was not violence, it was harmony, ritualized pain for the sake of celestial and bodily alignment. If the leech was a silent doctor, then the bloodletter was his louder, sharper cousin. Barbers performed surgeries in the same chairs where they shaved faces and clipped beards. Their signs, the red and white pole, symbolized the blood and bandages of their dual trade. A barber surgeon might lance a vein with a practiced flourish, catching the arc of blood in a glazed bowl painted bright red so as not to alarm the patient. For the upper classes, the act was refined, scheduled, even fashionable. Bled in spring, bled again in autumn. The body was a vessel, and like any vessel, it required drainage. The poor, of course, were bled less delicately. Street barbers might use unsterilized blades, might cut too deep or too long. Infection was common, fever more so. There was a diagram often copied into medical manuscripts and pinned to infirmary walls of a human figure, arms spread, marked with letters indicating the best places to cut. A for the cephalic vein, B for the basilic, The man in the diagram bled eternally, quietly, his expression neutral, as though unaware of the red ink flowing from his limbs. Bloodletting was timed to the moon. Lunar phases dictated when the body was most responsive to release, when certain organs softened, when the spirits aligned with skyward tides. This was not superstition in the derogatory sense, stitched together from ancient theory, Galenic medicine, astrological wisdom, and the empirical rhythm of generations. A good bloodletter knew the stars. A great one knew the person, their temperament, complexion, humoral disposition. Melancholic types bled black bile, cholerics ran hot and needed venting. Phlegmatics required balance through other means. To observe a bloodletting was to witness both performance and practicality. The tourniquet was tied, the veins struck, the blood caught, the patient light-headed but trusting. Some fainted, others cried. A few sang hymns. A strange intimacy existed between cutter and cut. Records exist of kings being bled before battle, of bishops insisting on the ritual to cure grief, of peasants demanding it in fits of anxiety. The body had to be opened to speak. The blood was its confession, and behind every leech and lancet stood someone forgotten, the marsh girl whose calves still stung, the barber's boy rinsing bowls behind the curtain, the widow who sold her jars of slick worms to the apothecary without so much as a thank you. These were the people who kept the machinery of medieval medicine humming. Their labor was unsightly, often dangerous, and always underpaid. Yet without them, the theory could not become practice. The prescriptions written in Latin on vellum meant nothing. If there were no leeches in the jar, no blade honed and ready. Some towns tried to regulate the trade. Collectors needed licenses, but the work remained rough at the edges. A noblewoman in York once bled to death after an unskilled barber struck an artery. In Paris, a scandal erupted when counterfeit leeches painted black slugs were found in a merchant's supply. In plague years, leeches were thought to pull infection from the skin. In bad years, they were blamed for illness altogether. They were healers, then harbingers. They never stopped being hungry. Over time, the practice of bloodletting declined, not suddenly, but in waves. Sterilization replaced astrology. And yet the leech did not vanish. It simply adapted. Today, it survives in modern hospitals, used in microsurgery to stimulate blood flow after tissue grafts. The old professions, whomp waiting, blood trading, has become sanitized, clinical, even respected, but the memory lingers. Somewhere, perhaps in the corner of a bog, a child once stood still as a reed, watching the water for movement. Somewhere, a patient once prayed that the bleeding would be enough to restore their mind, their balance, their hope. And so the blood flows, still in thought, in history, in memory. It is not the violence that disturbs us now, but the calm with which it was once administered, the serenity of the man in the diagram, the silence of the woman in the bog, the hush of a crowded barber's stall at dawn, a world where pain was measured, scheduled, necessary, where suffering was not to be eradicated, but redirected outward in the arc of blood into a bowl, into the mouth of a leech, outward toward balance, toward peace. In the winding alleys of a medieval town, where the gutters frothed with slop and the rooftops shed soot like ash from the sky, there was one job so reviled that even the mud-spattered butcher boys averted their eyes when passing the workshops. It belonged to the fuller, a laborer whose purpose was to purify, shrink, and strengthen woolen cloths, but whose methods, to any nose untrained in the business of stench, were enough to turn breakfast back upon the tongue. Long before bleach or soap were known in the wider textile trade, the best tool for cleansing wool was stale urine collected from chamber pots, troughs, and the discreet donations of neighbors. Human waste, left to ferment into a potent chemical bath, held the power to scour grease from raw fleece, tighten its fibers, and give fabric its enduring softness. The result was often beautiful. The process was unspeakable. A fuller did not wear finery. There was no illusion to maintain. Day after day, he or sometimes she, when labor needs outweighed, decorum would climb barefoot into great tubs of soaking cloth and wade through a stew of wool, warm, stale urine, and earth-stained water. The mixture was known as lant, and its pungency would coil into the sinuses like smoke from a sour fire. The fuller's task was to tread. There were no tools beyond the human body and the heavy foot, so the fuller's feet became their hammer and their press, crushing the cloth again and again beneath their soles, twisting their ankles in slurry. They coaxed grease and lanolin from the raw material until the wool could be wrung clean, at least clean enough by medieval standards. The work was rhythmic but brutal. A single session might last hours, and the tub would not drain itself. One batch of cloth could take an entire day to process, with no respite from the acid reek that rose with every stomp. The feet blistered first, then they hardened, skin peeled, then calloused over again, and the ammonia in the urine, corrosive, sharp, and relentless, crept into every scratch and softened every scab until infections became as regular as the sunrise. In winter, the tubs were cold and the feet went numb. In summer, the smell hung in the air like a physical presence, clinging to the fuller's clothes, the hollows of their ears, the folds of their skin. There was no hiding from it, no bath deep enough to draw it out. Most fullers worked in the margins of towns, near rivers or streams that could bear away the liquid waste. Their homes were often nearby, small and soot-dark, and the smell of their trade followed them even into their bedsheets. Children of fullers were marked by the same odor, which meant that even the young were set apart. To marry into a fuller's family was a rare thing. Respectable guilds kept their distance, and even the cloth merchants who profited from the fuller's work often did so with disdain. Fullers were necessary but despised, essential to fashion and trade, but shunned from polite society. Their hands made fabric wearable, yet their presence was a reminder of what filth the finery had risen from. And yet, for all their low station, fullers held a strange kind of power. In cities like London or Paris, they formed their own communities, sometimes even their own guilds, and the knowledge of their craft was passed through generations. Techniques varied from region to region. In some places, the urine was mixed with fuller's earth, a kind of clay that helped absorb oils. In others, soot or ash might be added to the mix. The timing of the treading, the thickness of the cloth, and the temperature of the bath all demanded attention and skill. A careless fuller could ruin a bolt of wool, leaving it too thin, too stiff, or unevenly felted. A masterful fuller, though rarely praised, was nonetheless sought after by tailors and dyers alike. His hands, despite their grime, held the final step between fleece and fashion. In ancient times, the practice had been formalized. The Romans taxed urine, seeing it as a valuable commodity for both cloth and leather work, and left behind records of entire operations built around its collection. Chamber pots were emptied into designated jars marked for fuller's use. By the medieval period, the same principles remained, though the sophistication had waned. People knew, simply, that old urine worked, that it brought brightness to dull cloth, that it stripped the sheep from the wool. So they gave it freely, or sold it cheaply, often to boys who made their rounds with pails, shouting their trade through the alleys like milkmen in reverse. The role of the fuller was one of contradiction. His labor rendered cloth pure, yet stained him with filth. He worked in the service of cleanliness, yet was marked as unclean. It was a paradox woven into the very fabric of the Middle Ages, where the means of beauty were so often born in muck. A noblewoman might wrap herself in wool that had once soaked for hours in the bath of a fuller estub. She would never know, or if she did, she would not say. She might praise the softness, the warmth, the way it hugged the line of her figure, but she would not mention the man who had trodden that same fabric beneath blistered feet while breathing in fumes that stung his lungs raw. Some cities passed laws about fullers, not out of concern for the workers, but out of fear of the stench. In York, it was forbidden to process cloth in certain areas of the town. In Florence, fullers were restricted to quarters along the river where the water could carry their waste away. In London, complaints about the smell arose in city records again and again. The authorities could not ban the trade outright. It was too important, but they could push it outward, into the margins, where the fullers might labor unseen and unspoken of. The invisibility became part of the job. To be a fuller was to live in shadow, to contribute quietly, and to endure. The treading was not always done barefoot. In colder regions, fullers wore special shoes, thick-soled, and often wrapped in cloth, but these quickly became soaked, and the protective layer turned to sludge. The sensation of stomping wool beneath one's feet through a slurry of urine and filth was not one easily forgotten. The cloth twisted and writhed under pressure, heavy with wetness, clinging to ankles like something alive. And yet, through this process, it transformed. The grease left by the sheep's skin dissolved, the fibers contracted, the cloth tightened into something more durable, more refined. It became cloth that could be dyed, sewn, worn, cloth that might one day be part of a bishop's robe or a merchant's coat. But in that moment, it was nothing more than fabric and filth and aching knees. There were stories of fullers who went blind from years of exposure to fumes, of ulcers that refused to heal, of children born with misshapen limbs after mothers worked too long in the bathhouse. Whether these were medical truths or tales born of gossip is hard to say, for few cared enough to record them. The foolers' voices rarely made it into the annals of history. Their names were absent from chronicles and charters. Their lineage went untraced. But their work was there in every cloak that kept out the cold, every tunic that covered a servant's skin, every robe that rustled across cathedral floors. They were the hidden hands behind warmth and modesty and elegance, and their legacy, like the ammonia they labored in, clung invisibly to the cloth long after the scent had faded. In the towns where they lived, foolers often lived near the tanners and the dyers, those other purveyors of useful stink. Together they formed a kind of olfactory caste, defined less by pay than by odor. Their children played together, their dogs shared scraps, their wives traded bread and gossip. Among themselves they held no shame. The shame came from without, from the silk-clad guildmasters who turned up their noses, from the clergy who warned of sin lurking in filth, from the apothecaries who refused to treat them for fear of contagion. And still the foolers labored, because cloth was needed, because warmth was prized, because someone had to make the beautiful wearable, and there was no other way. Even centuries later, when the process had evolved and chemicals replaced urine, the memory lingered. The smell may have faded, but the place of the fuller remained unchanged, low, necessary, and forgotten. Their tubs were dismantled, their treading pits filled in, their stories buried beneath the louder tales of knights and merchants and kings. But the wool remains, the fabric survives, and if you hold it close enough and breathe deep enough, perhaps you can catch the faintest memory of the bath it once knew. The ghost of a step, the echo of a footfall in a tub of land, the invisible signature of a laborer no one dared name. There was a particular odor that clung to the outer lanes of every medieval town, an acrid perfume that wafted beyond the hedgerows and lingered at the bottom of boots and cloaks. It came from the tanner's quarter, a place exiled by necessity, by law, and by revulsion. Skin, when removed from its owner, is not polite. It resists being transformed. It decays quickly and loudly. The tanners, those quiet alchemists of flesh, knew this intimately. Their hands were stained with lime and laced with cuts that never seemed to close. They worked in low sheds with dripping beams and pitiful windows, surrounded by shallow vats that steamed with chemical vengeance. And yet, within these vats and frames, the second life of animals began. Leather for shoes and belts and bookbindings, hide for armor and wine sacks, flesh repurposed into civilization's surface. Tanning was not merely a trade, but a prolonged confrontation with mortality. The work began with death, not their own, but a death close enough to remind them. Cattle, goats, sheep, pigs, sometimes horses, or deer arrived in carts from the slaughterhouse, their hides still warm. These skins, once part of a body, had to be stripped of everything that made them recognizable. First came soaking in water, then bathing in lime to loosen hairs and fat. Then the scraping began. On long wooden beams called saddles, men leaned forward and shaved the skin with curved blades. Again and again, until it forgot it had once been alive. They called it fleshing, but there was little tenderness in the act. The stench was apocalyptic. The lime burns flesh and nostril alike. The hair rots off into slime. And then came the dog dung, or pigeon droppings, or even chicken waste, anything that could be fermented into enzymes useful for softening leather. Known as baiting, this stage required the hides to be massaged with excrement, often by hand, and left to stew in shallow pits. It sounds unthinkable now, but to a medieval tanner, this was refinement. This was art. The dung broke down proteins and left the hide pliable and strong, ready to hold the shape of a shoe or the curvature of a saddle. In many cities, the profession was legally required to operate downstream of the general population so that their runoff would not poison those of higher birth. No one wanted a tanner as a neighbor, but everyone needed one. The irony of it all is that these same tanners were indispensable. Clergy needed parchment for copying scripture, which meant sheep vellum made by hand. Nobility demanded leather gloves and gilded book covers. Merchants wanted boots that would not rot and belts that would not tear. Even executioners and surgeons came calling, needing straps and slings and bound handles for blades. Skin, in every form, held the weight of civilization. And yet the men who prepared it were often barred from churchyards. Their touch was thought impure. Their homes lay near bogs and marshes, where wind could carry the scent away, and where rats came freely. In some towns, tanning became a hereditary caste. Fathers passed down their pits and frames to sons. Apprentices were taken in young, sometimes orphaned boys, with no dowry or inheritance, taught to stomach the work one foul week at a time. The first lesson was always the same: do not flinch, not from the smell, not from the blisters, not from the sound of the hide as it gave way beneath the blade. You could not haften a skin. Either you turned it into something useful, or it rotted into sludge. There were no shortcuts. The tools were old and sacred in their way. The drac knife with twin handles, the stretching frames with iron nails, the stone weights for pressing. Some tanners carved marks into their blades, protective symbols or personal runes. A few buried bits of bone or ash beneath their workbenches, whispering prayers before the day's scraping began. It is easy to imagine the rituals of cleanliness in a monastery, the pressing silence of candlelight on scripture. It is harder, perhaps, to imagine the rituals of the tannery, but they existed. They were gestures made to keep the body and soul in their places, to remind the man he was reshaping death, and that death, in turn, would reshape him. The process could take weeks. After baiting and washing, hides were soaked in vats of tannin-rich bark oak, chestnut, sumac, depending on region and season. The bark was crushed and boiled. The infusion turned to astringent liquid. Tannin binds to the collagen in skin, preventing decay and stiffening the fiber. This was true transformation, not just preservation. Slowly, the hide darkened and toughened. It began to forget its past life. In towns like Cordoba, tanners developed elaborate techniques for dyeing and finishing, turning the raw material into supple leather for Moorish book covers or Christian prayer stools. In the north, black leather was favored heavy, creaking, stained with iron salts. Everything was adjusted for purpose. Sometimes human skin passed through these same stages, quietly, illegally. There were whispered cases during times of war or execution, when the hide of a criminal or enemy was tanned into grim trophies. A purse made from a thief's belly, a drum from the back of a fallen general. These were not common, but they were not unknown. The line between leather and flesh was thin, and the mind of man has always been curious. In France, the National once housed a book bound in the skin of an executed criminal. In England, the skin of murderers was sometimes used to bind trial records. The punishment was not only death, but absorption into record, an eternal casing of one's own guilt. The tanners rarely spoke of such things. Their days were long and full enough. Their backs hurt and their teeth yellowed from exposure. They chewed mint leaves and smoked pipes to cut the smell. Their wives washed clothes twice as long. They were not storytellers. They were reminders. Every town had at least one. Some towns had a whole district where the alleys ran brown with runoff and the rooftops hung with drying skins. Children were warned not to play there. Cats kept their distance. But when a pair of boots lasted through a war, or a book survived 100 years, someone always remembered the tanner's hands. And it was not just cattle. The art extended to goats and deer, to pigs and dogs, and occasionally to humans. The skins behaved differently. Goat hide was thinner, more elastic. Cowhide was thick and durable. Pigskin took dye well, and human skin, when used, was said to resemble parchment, a little too intimate. Some doctors experimented with tanned human hide for surgical bindings or experimental texts. Most denied it. A few did not. There were also taboos. Skins from animals that had died naturally were avoided, too soft, too prone to rot. The hide had to come from fresh death, ideally from a beast still warm, the sinews intact. Some tanners claimed they could smell the fear in a skin taken from a hunted animal, that the adrenaline lingered in the fibers. It made the leather jumpy, they said, less willing to take the tan. Of course, the science of it was still centuries away, but the instincts were real. In parts of Italy, some tanners swore by full moon work. They said the skin dried evenly under certain lunar conditions. In Germany, tanning guilds developed secret signs, passwords passed between members to guard trade secrets. And in England, laws were written to forbid the dumping of tannery waste into rivers, though enforcement was lax. No one liked to go near a tanner's vat. No one wanted to know what floated in it, but leather endured. More than the flesh it replaced. In museum vaults and antique trunks, it still waits. Straps and belts and bindings. The corset of a long-dead noblewoman, the glove of a bishop, the saddlebag of a soldier who never returned. And somewhere deep in a cathedral archive, a book cover too smooth to name. They say the nose remembers what the mind forgets. Perhaps that is why the tanner's scent never quite leaves a place. It clings to thresholds and cellar doors. It whispers from the backs of drawers. It is the smell of labor and transformation, of skin made into memory. And if you follow it long enough, Through alleys and broken hedges, you might come to a wooden door, stained dark with time. Inside, a beam still waits, and a knife rests beneath it, not sharp, just honest, and beside it a hide stretched tight, ready to forget. They moved through alleyways that the cobblers would not enter, and slid beneath floorboards that even the dogs avoided. The rat catchers of medieval cities were not men of fame or finery. They did not wear velvet doublets or carry saintly relics. They bore nets and sacks and scars that ran from wrist to shoulder, hidden beneath sleeves that smelled of rotting grain and wet fur. Some called them necessary, others called them cursed. Most called them only when things began to scratch in the walls at night, or when children began to cry at the movement under their beds. It was not an occupation chosen with joy. Rat catchers inherited their work, or fell into it by desperation. Apprenticeships were informal. One learned by being bitten often, and by watching closely. There were those who claimed special knowledge, the ability to hear nests through stone, the instinct to know where plague rats bred, but mostly it was a dirty task made possible by a dark kind of patience and the tolerance for crawling into spaces that stank of things recently dead. In some cities, they were issued tokens or permits, signs to hang around their necks, to warn others not to touch them. In others, they were regarded as pariahs, part animal, part man, more pest than savior. The job itself was gruesome in its intimacy. Rats were not just caught, they were stalked. Poison was rarely used at first, not only because it was expensive, but because it risked leaving bloated corpses behind walls and beneath hearthstones where the smell of their slow liquefaction would last 4 months. Instead, the catchers relied on traps of iron and wood, sometimes baited with meat, sometimes with sweetbread soaked in oil. They placed them near grain stores, in thatches, behind the bones of collapsed buildings. A rat that screamed in a trap could draw more rats, or at least provide satisfaction to those who paid for their removal. The sound was said to be unlike any other, a scream that did not stop even when the jaw cracked. Some catchers used dogs, small wiry terriers, bred not for friendliness but for bloodlust. These animals were companions in name only. Their loyalty was to the chase, not the man. Others trained ferrets, sleek creatures who darted into burrows and dragged rats out by their throats. There were stories of catchers who developed a strange affection for the very vermin they hunted, keeping the odd albino rat in a cage beside their bed, whispering to it in the early morning hours as though it were a priest. The plague made their work vital and vile. As bodies began to pile in the gutters, as the sweet scent of death curled through the city like fog, the rat catchers were called in earnest. People no longer whispered their names in shame. They shouted them from windows, desperate for relief, from the creeping certainty that death moved on 4 legs. Though few understood the plague's true transmission, many believed rats were harbingers of it, and indeed, the black slicks of fur pouring from granaries did not inspire calm. City councils hired rat catchers in numbers, offering coin per tail or per sack. They became part of the machinery of survival, like the plague doctors and the grave diggers, but with far less prestige. Their job was not to save souls or measure contagion. It was to disappear creatures. Their success was measured not in lives spared, but in silences restored. If a house grew quiet again, if no more scurrying was heard in the larder, then the rat-catcher had done his duty. He would be paid and shown the door, never asked to stay for tea. In France, they were called chasseurs de rats. In Germany, Rattenfänger. In London, they were known simply as catchers. Some wore belts of tiny cages, like grim jewelry. Others carried hooked poles to drag nests from rafters. One 17th-century pamphlet describes a man in Norwich who boasted of removing over 10,000 rats in a single year, although no one asked how he counted. The same text mentions that his hair had turned gray by 30, and that his wife left him because the smell never went away. The methods they used were born of trial and terror. Some soaked cloths in sulfur and burned them in cellars to smoke the rats out. Others scattered powders made from dried fox gall or powdered arsenic root. These compounds worked poorly and often poisoned household pets. Still others claimed to speak rat language, to be able to whistle notes that made rats drown themselves in barrels. Such claims were usually offered alongside a raised price. Legends grew, as they always do, around those who touch death. In Germany, the Pied Piper tale may have had its roots in rat catchers who claimed to clear whole towns with song. More likely, they had simply discovered that starvation did more than poison, and that when food was removed, the rats left too. But myth is more memorable than method, and many believed the best catchers were those who had bargained with something darker than nature. They were not always welcome. After a house was cleared, it might be burned, or the occupants might be quarantined for fear the rat catcher had disturbed more than vermin. There were reports of men refused entry to churches or taverns. Children were told not to speak to them. Some believed they carried the plague in their boots. Others accused them of spreading the rats themselves to ensure continued employment. These rumors did not help their social standing. By the time early pest control theories began to circulate, the rat catcher had become both symbol and scapegoat. Pamphlets and broadsheets published in the 17th and 18th centuries proposed new municipal methods for vermin reduction. Sewers were examined. Grain stores were fortified. But the rat catcher remained, trudging through the filth with his bag and his gloves and his 1,000-yard stare. He was a man without illusions. He knew what bred in the corners of civilization. Some towns instituted bounties. Children would bring rat tails to town halls in exchange for pennies. These tails were sometimes faked, snipped from cats or dogs, or even carved from eel skin. Fraud was rampant. So too was desperation. In London in 1665, during the Great Plague, records show that some neighborhoods collected over 10,000 rat tails in a single month. The bodies were dumped in pits or burned in great piles. The smell became part of the season. The work, of course, was not effective. Rats continued to breed. Plague continued to spread. The true vector, the flea, was largely unknown. Killing rats may have briefly disturbed colonies or reduced food competition, but it did not stop the death. And yet the catchers persisted. They were hired again and again because they were visible, because action was better than silence, because sometimes it felt better to pay a man to crawl into darkness than to simply wait for the cough. Their legacy is faint. We remember the Pied Piper, but not the others. the nameless men who dipped their hands into crawl spaces and came out with handfuls of teeth, who buried their kills outside city walls because no one would let them use the dump, who died young, often and alone. Their names do not appear in church ledgers. Their profession was rarely passed down through writing, but their work stitched itself into the daily fight against death. Even now, something of them remains. The pest control man in his van, the traps set in basements, the lingering sense that somewhere in the walls is something ancient and clawed and watching. We do not thank the rat catcher. We barely see him, but in the long sleep of history, his footsteps can still be heard in the dark. In the quietest rooms of the grandest Victorian homes, something ancient persisted, just out of sight, a warm body rocking a cooler. A woman not of the household feeding the infant of another from her own breast, her own child, left behind or dead, or never known, a wet nurse, sworn to silence, paid in coin and social absence, hired to perform the soft violence of substitution in a world where milk meant survival and maternal touch could be outsourced. This was women's hidden labor, the invisible scaffolding that held up the show of domestic gentility and noble restraint, a life of bodily intimacy without recognition, where care was a transaction and the body was the gone still. The scullery maid worked among coal soot and potato skins, her hands raw from lye, her spine bent by the iron pots. She was tasked to clean so that others could eat with porcelain and grace. Hers was the grease behind refinement, her labor so constant it erased itself in the daily repetition of drudgery. She was the least among the servants, but without her the house would rot, would crumble, would drown in its own excess in the eyes of the upstairs world. She was barely a name sometimes, only a body passed down in lists of household accounts, along with mops and candles and meat. She was the girl without a voice, but with a basin and a broom, and she moved through the bowels of the house like breath, to walk the shadow edge of power and peril, their hands deep in the blood of life and death, respected when needed, distrusted when not. They carried ancient knowledge, passed down through word and practice, through generations of women who understood herbs and pulses and the unspoken signs of a child about to arrive or a mother about to vanish. The male medical profession eyed them with suspicion, declaring them unsanitary, untrained, irrational, even as they relied on them in rural villages and among the poor who could not afford doctors. They were not always literate, but they knew how to turn a breech birth. They knew how to comfort a widow. They knew how to find the fever before the body did, and sometimes they knew how to hide a birth that society was not prepared to see all. The wet nurse, the midwife, the maid moved through Victorian life like shadows made of flesh, of history, unless a scandal dragged them blinking into daylight, or a death certificate bore witness to their failure. Even then the blame clung to them like ash. A maid accused of theft, a midwife blamed for infection, a wet nurse whispered about in terms of disease or moral contamination. Yet without them the ideals of family and purity and civilization itself would have collapsed. They were the bone beneath the corset, the calloused palm under the glove, the cracked nipple behind the lullaby. The labor of these women was not only physical, it was deeply emotional and psychologically exacting. To feed a child not your own while grieving one, you had to give away, to clean the chamber pots of a mistress who might not learn your name, to be present at the most intimate threshold of life without being invited to the christening or even spoken to at all. to spend. Your youth kneeling before stoves and cradles and sick beds, until your knees swelled and your mind dulled, and no one remembered what you looked like before your teeth began to fall out. This was not merely work, it was a form of historical invisibility, an erasure. By repetition, a deletion by utilitarian aristocratic circles. A wet nurse might be housed elsewhere, kept out of sight. Of the family's drawing rooms, her breasts were prized, but her presence was shameful. The double bind of being necessary and polluting at once. Some believed that her milk carried her temperament, her class, her sins into the child, that the emotions she felt while nursing could infect the infant's character. A child suckled by a melancholy woman might become depressive. A child fed by a coarse woman might grow crude. This was pseudoscience, but it was widely believed, and it placed on the wet nurse not just the burden of nourishment, but of emotional hygiene. She was expected to be cheerful, content, docile, well-fed, and endlessly available for the midwife. There was no such physical detachment. She was called into parlors and peasant huts alike. Her hands welcomed life into every class, but the respect she earned was fleeting, often conditional on the outcome. A healthy birth might bring coin and praise, a stillbirth, long after such claims were considered medieval. Echoes of this fear persisted, especially in rural corners of Britain and Ireland, where medicine and folk magic bled into each other in muddy alleys and candlelit. Of herbs, say prayers over the womb, or chant ancestral rhymes to ease labor, and sometimes these rituals worked, and sometimes they didn't, and the line between reverence and blame. Beginning service at 12 or 13, their growth stunted by diet and exhaustion, their eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, they cleaned the servants' quarters before even seeing the family's rooms. They emptied the chamber pots of other maids before being allowed to touch those of the lady of the house. They were at the bottom of a very steep and slippery hierarchy, and many never climbed higher. Illness, injury, or the smallest mistake could send them back to the streets, or worse, into the arms of men who saw them as disposable bodies. Their lowly station and constant exhaustion made them targets, and the pregnancies that followed often led to dismissal or institutionalization or early death. The census rarely recorded these women by name. Often they were listed by position or age, or simply noted as female domestic servant. Their lives archived in dust, their stories the smooth illusion of the household machine. Then and only then did the scullery maid become visible, usually in tragedy or scandal. Then she had a name. Then she had a face, but it was the face of blame or pity, never of gratitude. There were uprisings in small ways, a wet nurse refusing to return after a day off, a midwife defending her herbal methods against a pompous physician, a maid who broke a plate on purpose and watched it shatter like the illusion of her obedience. These acts of resistance were rarely recorded and often punished, but they happened, and they mattered because they chipped away at the silence. They were gestures of selfhood. In a world that demanded submission, these women carried physical burdens that modern hands can scarcely imagine. A newborn strapped to the chest while washing another family's clothes, the constant ache of breasts overfull of milk, the bloody work of delivery on stone floors in winter, the endless stooping, lifting, hauling, and scraping, all done with the expectation of invisibility, done in service of an ideal of femininity that they themselves were not allowed to embody. They were the mirror in which respectable womanhood preened, but they were forbidden to look into it themselves. Some households, midwives, and wet nurses became entangled in complicated emotional ties with the families. They served a child might bond more closely with the nurse than the mother. A woman might confess her secrets to the midwife during labor. In pain or panic, these moments created strange kinships, neither family nor servant nor friend, a ghostly intimacy that ended when the child weaned or the baby died or the family moved away. These women held the memories of births and miscarriages and fevers and infant deaths that no one else wanted to remember. Their minds became graveyards of forgotten children, their silence the tombstone, and still they worked because there were mouths to feed and no other work that paid for women of their class and station, no schools that admitted them, no apprenticeships that welcomed them, no property. They could inherit their bodies or their resume, and their labor vanished into the cracks of history, leaving behind only softened soapstone handles and faded birth records and a vague whisper in the lineage of the rich that once someone had helped them come into this world. And no one were not saints, nor martyrs, nor angels. They were women doing what they had to do in a world that needed them but refused to honor them. They laughed when they could, they loved when allowed, they endured, they passed on their skills in kitchens and sick rooms and dark back stairways. And though the archives did not preserve their voices, their labor remains, embedded in the bones of old houses, in the pages of birth ledgers, in the language of care that still echoes quietly wherever a baby is rocked, or a room is scrubbed, or a body is prepared for burial. And somewhere beneath all that history, their hands are still moving, silent, unseen, indispensable. In the quietest rooms of the grandest Victorian homes, something ancient persisted, just out of sight, a warm body rocking a cooler. A woman not of the household, feeding the infant of another from her own breast, her own child left behind or dead. Or, never known, a wet nurse sworn to silence, paid in coin and social absence, hired to perform the soft violence of substitution in a world where milk meant survival and maternal touch could be outsourced. This was women's hidden labor, the invisible scaffolding that held up the show of domestic gentility and noble restraint, a life of bodily intimacy without recognition, where care was a transaction and the body was the contract. She rose before the mistress, and she slept after the house had gone still. The scullery maid worked among coal soot and potato skins, her hands raw from lye, her spine bent by the iron pots. She was tasked to clean so that others could eat with porcelain and grace. Hers was the grease behind refinement, her labor so constant it erased itself in the daily repetition of drudgery. She was the least among the servants, but without her, the house would rot, would crumble, would drown in its own excess in the eyes of the upstairs world. She was barely a name sometimes, only a body passed down in lists of household accounts, along with mops and candles and meat. She was the girl without a voice, but with a basin and a broom, and she moved through the bowels of the house like breath, itself unseen but utterly essential. Midwives to walked the shadow edge of power and peril, their hands deep in the blood of life and death, respected when needed, distrusted when not. They carried ancient knowledge, passed down through word and practice, through generations of women who understood herbs and pulses and the unspoken signs of a child about to arrive or a mother about to vanish. The male medical profession eyed them with suspicion, declaring them unsanitary, untrained. Among the poor who could not afford doctors, they were not always literate, but they knew how to turn a breech birth. They knew how to comfort a widow. They knew how to find the fever before the body did, and sometimes they knew how to hide a birth that society was not prepared to see all. 3. The wet nurse, the midwife, the maid, moved through Victorian life like shadows made of flesh. Their value measured in silence and sweat and sacrifice, their names rarely recorded in the great books of history, unless a scandal dragged them blinking into daylight, or a death certificate bore witness to their failure. Even then, the blame clung to them like ash. A maid accused of theft, a midwife blamed for infection, a wet nurse whispered about in terms of disease or moral contamination. Yet, without them, the ideals of family and purity and civilization itself would have collapsed. They were the bone beneath the corset, the calloused palm under the glove, the cracked nipple behind the lullaby. The labor of these women was not only physical, it was deeply emotional and psychologically exacting. To feed a child not your own while grieving one, you had to give away to clean the chamber pots of a mistress who might not learn your name, to be present at the most intimate threshold of life without being invited to the christening or even spoken to at all, to spend your youth kneeling before stoves and cradles and sickbeds until your knees swelled and your mind dulled and no one remembered what you looked like before your teeth began to fall out. This was not merely work, it was a form of historical invisibility, an erasure by repetition, a deletion by utility in aristocratic circles. A wet nurse might be housed elsewhere, kept out of sight of the family's drawing rooms. Her breasts were prized, but her presence was shameful, the double bind of being necessary and polluting at once. Some believed that her milk carried she felt while nursing could infect the infant's character. A child suckled by a melancholy woman might become depressive. A child fed by a coarse woman might grow crude. This was pseudoscience, but it was widely believed, and it placed on the wet nurse not just the burden of nourishment, but of emotional hygiene. She was expected to be cheerful, content, docile, well-fed, and endlessly available for the midwife. There was no such physical detachment. She was called into parlors and peasant huts alike. Her hands welcomed life into every class. But the respect she earned was fleeting, often conditional on the outcome. A healthy birth might bring coin and praise, a stillbirth might end her career, or worse, lead to accusations of witchcraft. Long after such claims were considered, medieval echoes of this fear persisted, especially in rural corners of Britain and Ireland, where medicine and folk magic bled into each other in muddy alleys and candlelit. Of herbs, say prayers over the womb or chant ancestral rhymes to ease labor, and sometimes these rituals worked, and sometimes they didn't, and the line between reverence and blame was dangerously thin. Scullery maids were often children themselves, beginning service at 12 or 13, their growth stunted by diet and exhaustion, their eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. They cleaned the servants' quarters before even seeing the family's rooms. They emptied the chamber pots of other maids before being allowed to touch those of the lady of the house. They were at the bottom of a very steep and slippery hierarchy, and many never climbed higher. Illness, injury, or the smallest mistake could send them back to the streets, or worse, into the arms of men who saw them as disposable bodies. Their lowly station and constant exhaustion made them targets, and the pregnancies that followed often led to dismissal. or institutionalization, or early death, the census rarely recorded these women. By name often they were listed by position or age, or simply noted as female domestic servant, their lives archived in dust, their stories surviving only through rare diaries, letters, or court records. When something went wrong, when something disrupted the smooth illusion of the household machine, then and only then did the scullery maid become visible, usually in tragedy or scandal. Then she had a name, then she had a face, but it was the face of blame or pity, never of gratitude. There were uprisings. In small ways, a wet nurse refusing to return after a day off, a midwife defending her, herbal methods against a pompous physician, a maid who broke a plate on purpose and watched it shatter like the illusion of her obedience. These acts of resistance were rarely recorded and often punished, but they happened, and they mattered because they chipped away at the silence. They were gestures of selfhood. In a world that demanded submission, these women carried physical burdens that modern hands can scarcely imagine. A newborn strapped to the chest while washing another family's clothes, the constant ache of breasts overfull of milk, the bloody work of delivery on stone floors in winter, the endless stooping, lifting, hauling, and scraping, all done with the expectation of invisibility, done in service of an ideal of femininity that they themselves were not allowed to embody. They were the mirror in which respectable womanhood preened, but they were forbidden to look into it themselves. Some households, midwives, and wet nurses became entangled in complicated emotional ties with the families. They served a child might bond more closely with the nurse than the mother. A woman might confess her secrets to the midwife during labor. In pain or panic, these moments created strange kinships, neither family nor servant nor friend, a ghostly intimacy that ended when the child weaned or the baby died or the family moved away. These women held the memories of births and miscarriages and fevers and infant deaths that no one else wanted to remember. Their minds became graveyards of forgotten children, their silence the tombstone. And still they worked because there were mouths to feed, and no other work that paid for women of their class and station, no schools that admitted them, no apprenticeships that welcomed them, no property they could inherit. Their bodies were their resume and their labor, their only coin, and so they labored and bled and soothed and scrubbed until they vanished into the cracks of history, leaving behind only softened soapstone handles and faded birth records and a vague whisper in the lineage of the rich that once someone had helped them come into this world, and no one quite remembered her name. Were not saints, nor martyrs, nor angels. They were women doing what they had to do in a world that needed them but refused to honor them. They laughed when they could. They loved when allowed. They endured. They passed on their skills in kitchens and sick rooms and dark back stairways. And though the archives did not preserve their voices, their labor remains, embedded in the bones of old houses, in the pages of birth ledgers, in the language of care that still echoes quietly wherever a baby is rocked, or a room is scrubbed, or a body is prepared for burial. And somewhere beneath all that history their hands are still moving, silent, unseen, indispensable. There is a kind of quiet poetry in the way filth and necessity walk hand in hand through the corridors of history. While kings polished their scepters and bishops polished their souls, someone was always polishing the privy seat. The dark underbelly of medieval labor was not merely a stain to be hidden. It was the glue holding everything together. The lowliest jobs, the least glamorous and most repulsive, were more than footnotes. They were the pages on which the story was written. And though their names were often unrecorded, though their hands were blistered and their feet soaked in sewage, the survival of an entire civilization depended on them getting up each morning and doing what no one else wanted to do. A gong farmer with his bucket, a leech collector with her thighs in the swamp, a plague cleaner hauling bodies from the threshold of someone else's sorrow. These were not noble professions, but they were necessary, and sometimes necessity is nobler than nobility. To live in a medieval city was to live in constant proximity to collapse. Sanitation was barely a suggestion. Rats ran through market squares with more confidence than citizens. Water was often poison. Food was frequently questionable. Medicine was something you whispered to God rather than trusted from a bottle. And the systems that did keep it all functioning is even the right word, were upheld by the invisible ones. The nightmen who emptied cesspits under cover of darkness because no one wanted to look at them. The laundresses who scoured noble linens until their hands cracked and bled. The executioner who was reviled even as the crowd demanded his services. These were not aberrations, they were infrastructure. It's easy to romanticize the past when you only read it from a safe distance. You see the architecture and forget the stench. You read the poetry and forget who had to clean the floors of the hall where it was recited. But beneath the veneer of Gothic arches and illuminated manuscripts was a world built on calloused hands and invisible suffering. In many towns, the lowest workers were prohibited from touching the town well, from entering the church by the main door, from sitting at the front during Mass. And yet, if they failed to show up, the whole system would shudder. If no one collected the waste, disease would bloom. If no one dug the graves, bodies would pile. If no one tanned the leather, no nobleman would have boots. There's a paradox in being essential but despised. One sees it even today. The garbage collector is invisible until the garbage isn't collected. The hospital janitor is ignored until the room smells of blood and bleach. These echoes stretch backward. In medieval times, the workers of least visibility often bore the heaviest burdens. They weren't just poor, they were unclean, both literally and symbolically. To be a dung carter was to be marked by your own usefulness. Children threw stones. Clerics preached about moral filth. Town records mentioned punishments not for crimes, but for existing too closely to the noble nose. And yet, when plague came, these were the only people who would approach the corpse. When flood came, they were the ones who shoveled muck from the cathedral's foundation. When war came, they dug the trenches and buried the limbs. Some of these professions passed from parent to child, as if hardship were an heirloom. It was not unusual for a daughter to inherit her mother's role as a fuller's assistant, or a son to continue his father's labor as a knacker. These were not trades learned so much as absorbed. Your body learned to withstand the stink. Mind learned to ignore the insults. And your heart learned to find a sliver of pride in being the one who showed up, even in a world that spit at you, because someone always had to do it. And if you did not, someone else's life would be measurably worse. It is perhaps fitting that many of these jobs were associated with thresholds of life and death, of waste and order. The grave digger, the gong farmer, the plague cart driver, the midwife attending births in the poorest quarters. They worked at the edges. They witnessed beginnings and endings more than most, and they carried the weight of those thresholds home in the seams of their clothing and the cracks in their skin. To be a washerwoman during a war was to know every soldier's wound before the surgeon did. To be a barber surgeon was to hold men's pain in your lap like a bloodied secret. To be a leech collector was to spend your days in stagnant marshes among biting insects and half-dead frogs, hoping the parasites you gathered would save someone wealthier than you from an infection they could have avoided with soap. Historians have often ignored these people. They appear rarely in records, except when fined or punished. They show up in literature only as caricatures or metaphors. But if you listen closely to the margins of a medieval document, you can sometimes hear them breathing. The court roll that mentions a cesspit, overflow, the ecclesiastical decree about improper bodily functions. The medical manual that assumes a body will be prepared for surgery by someone unnamed. These are the ghostly fingerprints of essential labor. And though the names are lost, the labor endures. There were rules, too, systems of rotation, guilds, even among the unclean. In some places, night soil collectors had specific routes and timetables, regulated by town councils. Gravediggers were often paid by the depth of the grave and the number of corpses interred. Tanners had to locate their vats downwind of respectable neighborhoods. Prostitutes were taxed more than preachers. Everyone had a place, even if that place was downwind, downhill, and downstream. But it wasn't all squalor. In their own communities, these workers found dignity, mutual aid, rotating shifts, rituals for purification, both spiritual and physical. A gong farmer might rinse with vinegar and light dried rosemary to cleanse the home. A washerwoman might sing songs over linens soaked in another woman's blood. The midwife might offer a prayer between contractions. It wasn't romantic, but it was resilient. These people did not have the luxury of believing they were chosen, but they were necessary, and sometimes, in the soft moments of shared toil, they found a kind of fellowship that the nobility never knew. There are folk tales about these workers, strange ones, stories where the corpse collector sees ghosts no one else can see, where the night soil man is the only one who knows a town's secrets, where the laundress becomes a prophetess because she handles the garments of the dead. These stories hint at something unspoken, that proximity to filth brings you close to truth, that those who handle decay know more about life than those who feast on silver, that the edge of society is sometimes the only place where society is real. Even the church, in all its grandeur, needed its floor scrubbed. Even the king, in all his pomp, needed his chamber pot emptied. And the people who did those things, who lived in the shadow of altars and thrones, were the backbone of everything. Their work was not noble, but nobility is not always honest. Their labor was not elevated, but elevation is often hollow. What they did was simple, and what they endured was immense. And still they rose each morning today. When we look at modern equivalence garbage, collectors, janitors, hospital aides, street sweepers, we see the same patterns. Essential but invisible. Revered in times of crisis, forgotten in times of comfort. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded some of us briefly that labor has a body, and that body often suffers. but memory is short, and once the emergency passes, the filth returns to the margins of attention, if not the margins of the city. So what do these medieval laborers teach us now? Not just that the past was dirty, though it was. Not just that class is cruel, though it is. But that dignity is not something handed down. It is something earned in silence. It is scraped together with broken nails and unwashed fingers. It is sung in the back room of a bathhouse or hummed from the back of a plague cart. These people were not celebrated, but they held up the sky. As you drift now toward your own sleep, consider this. The world we inherit is built on the shoulders of people whose names we do not know, people who worked while others looked away, who lifted when others sat, who suffered so others might not. Their legacy is not written in stained glass or royal decrees. It is written in the fact that the world did not collapse, that food reached the table, that the dead were buried, that the gutters did not overflow, and that even in the worst of times, someone showed up with a shovel, with a pail. So close your eyes. Now let the noise of the day settle. Let the quiet come in. Let the ghosts of labor drift gently into your dreams. They will not ask for thanks. They never did. But perhaps tonight they will finally be seen. Good night.